Afternoon. Gin in the USA, the American dream. I've done my research. I can tell you that I know that Donald Trump isn't going to do a line extension to the Trump vodka that he failed and went bankrupt on. And he's a teetotal, so he can't ruin the image of gin. So this is a good start. But they do say that you can measure a country by the amount of therapists and lawyers they have. So America is sort of the dream place to go. It's 11 million cases of gin, basically, and the allure to go there is big. But of course, I want to show you some of the dynamics of the market today to really sort of, if you're thinking of bringing your brand there, you know, what to look for. So this is just a few little things. I know that there's two great nations divided by one common language is a very famous thing, but it gets very confusing. And it took me about 3 years, I swear. It's a store, not a shop. On-trade, on-premise, on-trade, off-premise. You probably all know that one. A wholesaler here is a distributor there. A producer, you become a supplier. Then, of course, you have a broker, which would be your importer or your outsourcing of marketing and sales. This is where it gets really confusing. Retail means everything from the off-trade, the on-trade, bars, hotels. But if you're a retailer, that means you're a store. You with me? Yeah. If you, because that's where it starts. Just a little bit about myself. I moved to the United States. Actually, a guy called Charles Rolls and Nick Blacknell picked me up for Plymouth Gin in 1998, and they got me to launch it around the world. It took off a little bit in the US, and they moved there in 2005, and I've been there ever since. And I became the Director of Trade Marketing for Pernod Ricard. Along the way, I helped a friend with a couple of gin recipes, which was sort of my first foray into really doing something outside of Plymouth in gin. And we launched Ford's Gin, a gin that Charles Maxwell makes in September of 2012. And we have made every mistake you could imagine. And I am here today to hopefully alleviate some of that and some of those mistakes. But for those who aren't really thinking about launching a gin in the US, I wanted to share a little bit about America itself, because you can't really view America as one country when you're going there to sell a gin or launch your gin. You have to look at it as 50 tiny little ones. They all have their own laws. They all have their own rules. They all have their own distributors. You're going to need to find a new distributor in each of those places, unless you are very lucky and you get a national distribution account. But that is quite a rarity. And even in those instances, you still need to go to every single state. My advice at this particular moment is start small. Start with one or two and learn your mistakes that way. But it is, obviously, when you get there, there are many rewards to be had. But of course, one thing to know about America is gin was first. Well, Geneva to be precise, right? The VOC was launched in 1602, and they sent voyages out in 1609. Henry Hudson was one of the first to be there. And on board, they were very, very generous. It was between 130 and 150 liters per sailor. They would use it to barter when they got there. So gin, Geneva, whichever way you look at it, was definitely the very first spirit in the United States of America. And of course, New York became New Amsterdam became New York in 1662. It still really took off. Now, around 4,500 to 6,000 pipes of Geneva were going into the US in the 1850s, just to give you, or into New York in the, and that's around the same as 3.6 million 750 ml bottles. So gin truly was their spirit and their spirit of choice for a very long time. And if you look at the book written by Jerry Thomas in 1862, many of these famous drinks that we know now, the gin cocktail, the gin toddy, the gin fix, the gin julep, they're all in this book, but they really referred to those drinks as Geneva back then. They weren't really using gin, and this is where the definitions get a little bit confused. It's not until 1887 that you start seeing Old Tom gin introduced into cocktail books, and by the time you get to the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s, well, English gin is well on its way to becoming a major part of American culture. The first distillery to be built in the United States came in 1870. You may have come across this gin. It's now very much a bottom shelf gin. I'll explain what that means. But the 1880s was definitely this golden age of cocktails. Now, there's a book that was written which is kind of a compilation album of great cocktails from the time. It took lots of different cocktails from lots of different cocktail books, and it was called 1700 Drinks for the Man Behind the Bar. 50% of those drinks were made with gin. That is the impact that gin was having on the United States even back then, and this is the period that they really do refer to as the golden age. Drinks like the Gin Ricky from Washington, D.C., the Ramos Gin Fizz, obviously 1888 in New Orleans, when there was actually a shortage of workers. And of course, the whole reason that drink became so famous is you would shake the ice until it melted. And they would usually have about 12 bartenders shake one drink. That was the abundance of workers at the time. And it became one of the first classics because at Prohibition, even though it was a closely guarded secret, they put an ad in the paper sharing this recipe. And now today we make it all over the world. But it was really the martini and the martini's evolution, which obviously is a seminar and a talk in itself for another time, that really turned Americans on to English gins. And in particular, there's a couple of very famous articles that came out in the late 1890s that showed that the martini is moving its way into modern culture. One, Wedding by the Vanderbilts, where they were serving different martinis with various different gins, and it was listing the gins by name. And it really set in motion that the upper echelons of society were enjoying this drink called the martini. And even here you have another news item before it appears in a cocktail book in 1896, and the dry martini is sort of established for us and the rest of the world forever. But it was gin that was riding that wave, and gin becoming the #1 selling spirit in that part of the States at the time. And of course, the American drinking culture spread to the rest of the world. This one I like to mention as part of the historical side of this, but just to show how much cocktail culture had become the mainstream in 1916. This would be the equivalent of a 3-star hotel, so it wasn't the Savoy, it wasn't the Waldorf Astoria, but yet it got its own cocktail book, and a classic cocktail came from it. So gin had really sort of reached that mainstream. But then these guys came along. Now, these are the industrialists. I don't know if you recognize those guys, but these are the Rockefellers on this side, and that's Henry Ford. And they were very upset with this culture of drinking. It stopped the productivity of workers. People would stop for beers in the afternoon. And of course, they funded the temperance movements. Rockefeller signed a check to the Christian temperance movement for $4 million as one example of the many donations he made. That's about the equivalent of $60 million today. These gentlemen really wanted to see Prohibition end, as did the Anti-Saloon League, the Women's Temperance Movement, and so on and so forth. And this is obviously something that everybody in this room knows, but next is Prohibition. In 1920, all of these movements get enacted, and you're not allowed to sell alcohol. Bathtub gin, of course, becomes very, very famous. The reason this is important to this talk is because this moment leads to a lot of the things that are set in stone in the United States today. When it comes to liquor law, it's not like they have Mark Zuckerberg looking at, oh, actually, that wouldn't be a very good idea considering what's recently happened. But it's not like they have these great entrepreneurs looking after it. There's no Elon Musk in the liquor industry. And very much what happened during this time is being set into law now. I just put this little slide in because I like a bit of history, but gins were being made during Prohibition for medicinal purposes, which is always fun. So we go to Prohibition. Now, this is back to these laws. In 1932, the market crashes. It's terrible, 25% of people out of work. And you have this moment where we want beer was happening. And so one of the first laws that got changed, and anyone that's been to the US might see that you might see wine in some states being sold and beer being sold in gas stations, petrol stations, right? I got to use my Americanisms. This is I've lived there for 12 years. Apologies, you can make fun of me later. But in the petrol stations, you can buy beer to this day. You can buy wine to this day, but you can't buy spirits. They changed a rule in 1932 that allowed beer to become a grocery. And some people still actually enact that rule depending on where they are. So spirits are definitely harder to sell and have less channels than perhaps beer and wine. But that's just a good thing to know, and it was enacted in 1932 during the Great Depression. Part of the reason for the Great Depression, of course, stock market crashes, but also the government were not getting the taxes that they needed. So, of course, these prohibitionists all of a sudden sort of backtracked and realized that there was no respect for the law and that something needed to be put back in place. Now, this is J.D. Rockefeller Jr., and he plays a very significant role in all of this because he commissions this book, which you can buy on Amazon.com to this day, and it's called Towards Liquor Control. And this is a piece that he commissioned that really sets in motion what the US liquor rules are to this day. So essentially, someone who was a prohibitionist, who was anti-alcohol, has written the laws for alcohol in the US. The most significant one would be, the most significant rule would probably be that it was put into the state's control, and to this day you have things called State Control Board. This is a little bit more of history, but of course it was a hard time for gin in World War II. The three martini lunch era was a great time for gin. Actually, the British invasion was an excellent time for gin. There was very much, everyone liked the English at the time, and gin came back into vogue. Beefeater did particularly well in this period. And, but then vodka came along. Then discos came along, and cocktail culture was sort of kicked out by other cultures. I won't go into that. Bombay Sapphire definitely kept gin exciting in the United States for many years when vodka was really taking over. So did gin and juice, believe it or not. And Seagram still obviously is the biggest selling gin in the United States, over 3 million cases. Cocktail culture came back. Hendrix just invigorated the market. And now we have this world where there's lots of these, I won't use the word craft wherever Olivier is, but but the legit gins that are made well. You know, and the thing with gin in the US is a lot of these distilleries started out as whiskey distilleries, even some of the ones that were shown, you know, Koval, for example. And it doesn't make these not great gins, but their sort of first love was always whiskey, and that's where there's such a huge amount of gins in the US right now. It's like, I'm building a whiskey distillery, but I'm going to make some gin until my whiskey's ready. And that's why there are a lot of gins that are perhaps just tinkering along because they're really waiting for their whiskey to mature. I got to break some bad news to you. This is probably going to work. A Canadian guy representing an American whiskey, he's a celebrity, and it's going to go through the roof. But they are saying now that it is year of the gin, right? It's year of the gin. And they said that 10 years ago, but I actually truly believe it this time. This is just a little bit of stats, and I think it's important to know, because if you're thinking about your brand, you want to get your positioning right. The premium gin market, and these are actually provided by my friends at Bacardi, interestingly enough. You know, when you're a small brand, you can't get hold of statistics. Very difficult, but over 10 million cases. It's been in decline, but most of that decline has been Seagram's and smaller, the standard brands, the very cheap, under $10. The super premium, if you take Hendrix out of it, is actually quite a small segment compared to the premium segment, which is 4 million cases. So if you're thinking about your pricing, there is a bigger opportunity, but there's growth in both. This is a list of all the big brands. It doesn't seem to be reading that well. I can send this to you. It will be available, obviously, online. But most of that is standard. If you take out the cheap stuff, this is what it looks like. And the reason I show you this slide is the gin boom has not hit the United States yet. It is simmering in a pot, and it is ready. There is massive opportunity. You can see that there are the big fellas at the top, and then there's the leap, the chasm. Malcolm Gladwell pointed it out, and then there's a lot of people sort of primed to perhaps make it, and then there are a lot of smaller brands. So just to sort of summarize that little part, you know, this is the areas where growth is. You can see standard premium, super premium always doing well, value coming down, and you know, but there are bigger markets in premium. Cocktails, the cocktail movement there is as big as it is in the UK, if not bigger. It's hit every small corner. Even Utah, which is apparently a place where you can't get alcohol, has got great cocktail bars. If you are going after cocktail bartenders, the world is your oyster. So some advice. But to go back to this book that was enacted in 1934 with liquor law, has anyone heard of the three-tier system? Okay, this is where it gets very complicated in the United States of America. You cannot sell direct booze. You will probably need someone to help you import your booze for a starter. MHW, very well known, Park Street, very well known. They're the two big ones. But someone will need to come in and import. Then you will need to find a distributor. A distributor is likely to take, if you are a premium brand, 25 to 35% margin. Just, you need to know that ahead of time, unless you are the best negotiator in the world. All right? If you're a super premium, it might even be higher than that. I went in with, I will not take less than 25. And, you know, and in some instances, I managed to get my way, but in others, it's not. So you get a three-tier system, and you cannot sell around them. They will sell for you. Something that you also need to know is that they will not build your brand for you. You're going to need to do it yourself until you can either give them a lot of money or prove to them. So you can't rely on them just getting distribution. They will essentially be delivery. My other advice is make some friends within an organization so you've got one or two people that are looking after you and the things that you want to achieve as you launch. So they will take your products to a retailer. You're not supposed to talk price with a retailer. That's another thing. You're only allowed to talk brands. They're supposed to talk price, but you will agree with your distributor about what price is. So it's already complicated. In other states, they have a 4-tier system or a control board. The free market of America has decided that the government should run liquor in certain markets. And in these markets, it gets even more complicated. Anyone who's dealt with Canada or Sweden will know. And there are markets like that. In other markets, there are distributors, there are the liquor board, and then there's the brokers. And so it really does get very, very complicated. And you need to know in each market before you go in. Who's heard of franchise states? Great. Franchise states are the ones to really look out for. Franchise states means you cannot move your distributor. You will have to beg, maybe pay your way out. Don't go into a franchise state not knowing that you went into a franchise state and be unhappy with your distributor. It's very important. So as you can see, in not all of this, a lot of the power lies with the distributor. Now, they're not malicious people in any way. They want to see your brand grow. But obviously, they want you to do the hard work at the beginning. You know, they don't want to have a failed brand. It's unlikely that you're going to get into any fights, but it's worth knowing the position that you have. If you were a company wanting to sell your company, and you're in a franchise state that wants you to pay them $1 million to get out of a contract, that's $1 million that you've lost on the valuation of your brand. So things like that are very important to know as you go in. The TTB. The TTB are the ones that obviously they want to get your FDA approved formulas for your products. They want to approve your labels. It's very interesting. You know how sometimes you go through airport security and they want you to take your shoes off, and the next day they want you to keep your shoes on, but they shouted at you both times? That's a bit like dealing with the TTB. And I'm going to give you an example that was only last week. They asked me if I would put distilled from neutral grain alcohol on the front of my label. I responded by saying, and this is a new age gin that we're doing, I responded by saying, but why do I have to put it on the front of the label when everybody else has theirs on the back of the label? Their response was, you need to remove your age statement and you need to put that on the front of the label. So I sent them flowers, but really, this is just something to think about when you are dealing with the TTB. Now, I know this is going online, and hopefully I can still survive this. So the TTB are obviously trying to do the good thing in their eyes. They're trying to make sure things are running smoothly in liquor and that everybody is running to the same rules. If you put your cola in for your application for your label, and it gets to the top, it might take a couple of months, but when it gets to the top of the line, or the top of the queue, I'm just doing that again, sorry. When it gets to the top of the queue, and they need you to change something, you still remain at the top of the queue, so you don't lose that much time. But it's very important to know, because if you have a launch plan, and these things are coming along, and you've forgotten, you just want to go to the States with the product that you already have, these are things that you're still going to need to do. You're still going to need to go through compliance. And it gets more complicated, because once you have federal compliance, which is the whole of the states, you might need state compliance too. And so you need to look up state compliance. And I'll give you an example. In New York City, once you've got federal, you suddenly need state compliance, which is about a month. but you also need to post your price. And if you don't post your price, you have to wait till the next month. There'll be a deadline, so you could lose a month of business. Just not knowing to do that can cost you a month of business, so it's very important. There are pluses to this. You get to see the price of everybody else's gin, because posting prices is actually a fair trade thing. And I think that's a real gift for the entrepreneur. To know what everyone else is doing, it will let you put your product in at the right place. This isn't in every state. Pay-to-play is also illegal. We know about pay-to-play oh so well, right? Someone goes in and buys an entire menu and it makes it very difficult for the entrepreneur. That's technically illegal. And even though a lot of people find ways around it, they're clamping down on it. And that is another gift to the entrepreneur, because ultimately that's something that happens that pushes you out as an entrepreneur. Distributors. And I mentioned it at the beginning. And just to put some sort of context to the distribution system. Southern Wine and Spirits, right? I've got a sort of little case study here. Is the biggest distributor in the world. Been around, most of them have been around since Prohibition. A lot of the distributors. Obviously it makes sense because Prohibition started and we needed distributors, but who would have been the types of people that would have been in a position to open a distributor in 1933? Just think about it. I'm saying no more. I value my life. But 22,000 employees, 16.5 billion in sales. You're going to go over and you're going to want 1,000 cases in your first year, perhaps. Now you can imagine what a drop in the ocean you are. So you really have to be prepared to be the person that does this themselves. My advice is you are going to need somebody on the ground. You are going to need someone that can manage the distributor and the inventory in the US. There are brands that will get lucky and have such noise and have such presence outside of the US that they can just go there without all of this. But if you're going there, I suggest you definitely have a plan to not rely on your distributor, but just use them as someone that actually delivers to the account for you. But of course, definitely make friends within them. So this is sort of really going to address something that is, again, I tried to put the history in at the front because I thought the second part one might be a little bit boring. Every state has different rules to giving gifts. Every state has different rules to what you can put on a display in a store. Every state has different rules for what might be a nice piece of POS. For example, in Texas, anything that's over the value of £5 is considered a gift or a bribery. So you have to be very careful about what you choose to do. Now, when you are small, no one really notices and no one really cares. But it's just worth noting, I break the rules all the time. Oh, damn. I never break the rules, but some of you, may choose to. So my real suggestion is that the best money you can spend if you go to the United States is a little bit of money on a lawyer. I hate to say it, but I did say at the very beginning, you measure the success of countries on the amount of therapists, and you're going to need a therapist after a couple of years too, but therapists and lawyers. There's a guy called Ryan Malkin that I always recommend because he's very reasonably priced for the entrepreneur, but he'll give you a crash course in every state that you choose, and even give you contacts of people that can import and brokers and all of those different things. But very important. Now, I didn't want this to be a downer. I want more gin brands in the United States. I want that gin boom to happen. I'm there and I want it to really, really take off in the same way as I've seen it take off here, Spain, Australia. I've even seen it in Colombia go crazy, and I'd love to see the same thing happen in the United States. I'd love to see gins everywhere. I do see Haymans everywhere, but I'd love to see lots more gins everywhere. I'd really love to see Ford's gin everywhere. But this is just one last note on the distributor. This is actually a quote that was given to me. Ignore that it's Bacardi or Diageo. The point was it was big brands, but on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I worked for Bacardi, and Diageo was what he said to me. I actually once got punched by a friend from a small brand when I was working at Pernod Ricard because they couldn't hit their numbers because I had enforced something on them back then. But the truth is you're one of 5,000 brands to them, and it's really worth, when you're strategically thinking about your partners, worth thinking about. Sizing in America. just most people know this, and it really just, it's just more of a crash course for anyone that doesn't. But there is perception in all of this. When we launched Forged Gin in 2012, 95% of the on-premise sold bottles in liters. And that was almost how most companies would judge how well they were doing in the on and off-premise, was how much liters they're selling. That's changing with cocktail culture. Going to the United States now with a 750, which is the size that you would have to take, is perfectly acceptable. And it actually gives an even more premium message. So they've actually been following the cues of the rest of the world lately. So don't worry about that. When you get to this size, that means you are selling 1 million cases. So don't even think about it, right? Like Tito's just did it, you know, so I wouldn't worry. 750s is perfectly acceptable. If you really want to engage the bartender community with a premium proposition, then you might want to go liters, but that really is my advice. This was me saying that these days you can't really, you know, no one really cares about POS. You know how you know this pay-to-play moment it's illegal in the United States? So even if you might do some bits and pieces, you know how there's a Harvey Nichols bar? The Harvey Nichols bar might be the Perrier-Jouet champagne bar or the Veuve Clicquot champagne bars at Harrods, or you might go up to a club and there's a Tanqueray cocktail bar in it. That can't happen in the States unless you are a chain account, and chain accounts run in a very different way. So you're not going to see this kind of thing in the US, really. So this is really the one to take a picture of, because this is your sort of checklist for things to think about, questions to ask yourself in the United States. You know, it's an amazing market once you get to know it, right? That's what I really want to end with. It's an amazing market once you get to know it. It's an amazing market once you find those relationships within your distributor. It's an amazing market once you navigate some of those annoying rules at the beginning because they're different to what you knew before. And of course, the margins are really good. And Donald Trump, for everything that he's done wrong, has actually given all alcohol producers that are selling under 100,000 proof gallons a major tax break. It was once $13.90, now it's $2.90, so it's a massive saving. So it's a good time to go over there and make better margins as well. This is just another little recommendation. The Distilled Council of the United States of America, they write the guidelines for all of the brands. They're not necessarily the law, but they're things that they're trying to do to obviously make the laws better. These guys go to the government, they lobby to make things easier for spirits producers like us. And these are the things that they ask in response. And much of those are it's more the code of etiquette, if anything, on how you treat each other. And it's worth getting yourself a copy if you're going to go there. And I did this because that's your opportunity. When you go to a distributor, right? When you go to a distributor, the big guys on the left here, they're the ones pulling the strings, not you. But when it comes to vodka, this is packed. When it comes to whiskey, this is packed. When it comes to gin, there is a lot of opportunity to go into distributors and be the gin for them. So this is what the great opportunity is. And I did it in time. Thank you.